Hello and welcome to the Kick Sugar Summit, the world's first summit on the topic of sugar, sugar addiction, and sugar addiction recovery. We know that if we're going to reverse our rising rates of chronic disease, we need to reduce or eliminate our consumption of sugar and refined carbohydrates. We are here to help you do that. There are a lot of speakers on our summit and a lot of information. Don't get overwhelmed. Catch who you can and just let the rest go. Alternatively, you could purchase one of our Summit VIP packages, which comes with an awesome ebook summarizing the core insights of each speaker, a year's worth of resources from our world of experts, and access to a whole year of weekly drop-in live Q&As with me, Florence, your host. Thank you for being here. I hope you love the summit, and I hope it changes your life. Welcome, everybody, to an interview with Dr. Robert Lustig today. I hope he's not someone I need to introduce to you, that you've already watched his YouTube videos, you have read his books, and you're very, very familiar about his contribution to the topic of metabolic health around the world. But if you have not, let me introduce you. He is a professor emeritus of pediatrics. He's a medical doctor in the Division of Endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco. He specializes in the field of neuroendocrinology. His research and clinical practice has focused on childhood obesity and diabetes. And as you can imagine, in trying to crack that nut and figuring out how we can support his pediatric patients, it led him to explore metabolic health, which brought him back to the topic of sugar. Dr. Lustig has been a leader and a courageous one in the global discussion that we're having around metabolic health and nutrition. And he has been very brave at exposing some of the myths that underlie the current pandemic of diet-related diseases. He believes that the food business, by pushing processed food loaded with sugar, has hacked our brains and our minds and our bodies, compelling us to pursue pleasure at the expense of happiness. And he believes that today's epidemics of addiction and depression are directly linked. By focusing on real food, we can beat the odds of the lure of sugar and processed foods and reverse the downstream effects of our overconsumption of these processed foods, such as diabetes, obesity, depression, etc. Welcome, Dr. Lustig.
Thank you, Florence, but now I don't have to talk because you just said it all.
Oh, I know you well enough to
know. A wonderful introduction, and I have nothing more to say. Drop the mic and go.
Except there are some very interesting quotes that you have collected and put on your website. And I thought, oh, you know what I'd love to do is give you an opportunity to expand on them. So I got a graph about a week ago from a medical professor, a doctor working in the world. And he showed profits for pharmaceutical companies, this one particular pharmaceutical company, and they're all very robust and very healthy and very good. And then there's this massive spike, and it was like massive. And he goes, Ozempic. And on your website, there is a quote that says, "There is no medicalized prevention for chronic metabolic disease. There's just long-term treatment." And then there's another one, "Modern medicine is not the solution to the problem. Modern medicine is the problem." Would you like the opportunity to elaborate on those?
Well, so let's start with Ozempic and how crazy things are gotten. I just actually submitted a manuscript as a perspective to the journal Obesity, along with colleagues at Wake Forest. It's going to be point counterpoint, Jane, you ignorant slut, little back and forth. On the question of GLP-1 agonists. Their tack is they are game changers. And my tack was we're playing the wrong game. We're band-aiding instead of trying to actually fix the problem. And you can see how it would go on from there. The bottom line is obesity is not the problem. Obesity is a symptom of the problem. The problem is mitochondrial dysfunction. And there are a lot of things that cause mitochondrial dysfunction. Can obesity cause mitochondrial dysfunction? Yes, but you have to get really obese, and that's not what's going on for 80% of the population. But yet 93% of the population have metabolic dysfunction. So something more than just obesity is going on, and it's because our mitochondria are being poisoned. And there are, like I said, there are a lot of different poisons. Some of them are in the water, some are in the food, some of them are in the air, some are in the packaging, some of them in the plastic, some of them are, I mean, they're everywhere. You can't turn around. They are called environmental obesogens. And the question is, does Ozempic fix those? And the answer is, of course not. Doesn't even touch those. So yes, Ozempic and Wegovy and Mounjaro and the ones coming down the pike afterward, yes, they will promote weight loss, but at a huge cost, at a huge human cost, because these are not benign. As soon as you stop them, the weight comes rushing back because the mitochondrial function is still there, never went away. And it's the mitochondrial dysfunction that's going to kill you. And ultimately, it costs, if everybody who qualified for Ozempic in America got it, that would be $2.1 trillion to the healthcare bill, which is currently $4.1 trillion. So, but an extra 50%. Okay, we can't afford our current bill. So like that means there's going to be, apportionment, so the rich people get it, the poor people are going to not get it. That's going to make things even worse in terms of not just social disparity, but actually in terms of medical expenditures going down the tubes. And it doesn't really even work. So we have to fix the problem where the problem is. And the problem is in the environment. And that is the argument that I make in this perspective that hopefully will be published shortly. So that's the answer to the first question. Now, the second question was what again?
Oh my gosh. I was hoping you remembered it. I forgot.
That was so long ago.
Like, what was my second question? Yeah. But I wouldn't mind lingering there a little bit. I think that I've interviewed a lot of doctors, and they've said, you know what, I would be the first to recommend to my clients, eat better, move more, like get off the junk food, eat whole foods, go for a walk around the block, get to bed a little earlier, start there, really make some lifestyle changes, because it's as powerful a medicine as any I could prescribe.
Well, here's the problem.
Can I finish the thought so you can speak to it?
Sure.
And then the doctors will say, but I fear that they won't do it, and I've left them high and dry, and so I'm prescribing because they think they're not going to do that. So the best I can offer them is this prescription. Okay.
So there's truth to that, but it's not complete. And let me try to explain. There was a paper that came out just this week, and I really, really enjoyed this paper. I think they finally did it right. First author is Bonaccio, and it's in American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And what they did was they looked at an entire population on the Mediterranean diet who already have diabetes. So it's this very self-selected cohort. Mediterranean diet, but have diabetes. What they asked was, okay, we're taking Mediterranean diet as the baseline. So everybody's eating healthfully, at least as their baseline. What they then asked was, all right, what is this cohort's consumption of ultra-processed food on top of the Mediterranean diet? So some people ate none, some people ate a little, and some people ate more, and they divided them up into quartiles. And it turned out that the quartile who ate the Mediterranean diet, but also was the highest quartile in terms of ultra-processed food consumption, had a 64% increased rate of death versus the group that didn't consume any ultra-processed food. So what that's saying is that ultra-processed food is a poison, and the Mediterranean diet can't fix that poison. Toxin A plus antidote B still equals death. So it's not that the ultra processed food is filled with junk, which it is. It's that the ultra processed food is poison by itself. Okay, that would be the same if you were doing alcohol. That would be the same if you were doing cocaine. Okay, the highest quartile would be the ones who would have the highest mortality. Right. So this has nothing to do with what the food is. It has to do with the fact that ultra processed food is not food.
Right. There's no supplement, no superfood, no surgery, no pharmaceutical, no medicine, no miracle that can undo the damage sugar is doing to our bodies.
That's what metabolical was about. That's what that's what all the data say. But getting people to understand that, getting people to change that belief system, because they've been told for 50 years that sugar is love and sugar is family and sugar is 4th of July. You don't have 4th of July. You have 1st of July over there in Canada, but that sugar is empty calories is actually not true.
Right. There's a quote on your website: sugar is not dangerous because of its calories or because it makes you fat. Sugar is dangerous because it's sugar. Right. It's not nutrition. When consumed in excess, it is a toxin and it's addictive.
There you go. Nothing's changed.
Right. And as long as these pharmaceuticals, which I'm going to play neutral on it, but just as long as people know that when they're taking Ozempic or whatever, GLP-1, that it's not getting to the root cause. There was a doctor that I interviewed for the summit last week, and she said she recently went to a conference. She's an obesity trained doctor, and she went to this obesity conference, and one of the keynote speakers says, obesity is an incurable disease. It's incurable. And she just thought, it's heartbreaking. If they could understand that there is a cure, it's not an easy cure. We have to, eat whole foods and let the junk food go, but that there is a cure. What would you say about that?
Well, okay. So the problem is there's not one cure. So he's right in that respect. He said there isn't a, and a meaning one cure. Different people have different reasons. If you can figure out who's who, if you can establish the processes and or the biomarkers and or the behaviors and or the demographics and or the phenotypes or the genotypes that tell you who's who, and then apply appropriate modalities to that process, yes, you can absolutely turn it around. But it's complicated. And we don't have that flowchart yet. I mean, that's part of my job. That's part of what I'm trying to do, is develop that flowchart. I actually developed an early form of that flowchart based on insulin, okay, many, many years ago, and used it in clinic very successfully. 50% of my patients all got better. Now, having said that, 50% of my patients did not. Okay. But when I went to other clinics around the country and talked with my colleagues, who were doing the same thing I was with, their obesity programs, the best they did was 20% success. I got 50. And the reason was because not every patient was the same. So we had a method, a flow chart, an algorithm for figuring out who's who, and then applying that algorithm and trying to fix the actual pathology. And so you actually fix the pathology, then patients get better. So then it's toxin A plus antidote A equals health instead of death. All right. Point is, there's not one cause of obesity. And I'm very clear on that. There's not one cause of diabetes. And I'm very clear on that. Just so happens sugar's the one that's the most common, but it is by no means the only one. But it's the one that the food industry puts in the food for its purposes, not for yours. And it's the one that we could fix tomorrow if we had the political will to do so. Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, getting the PFAS out of the water is going to be really hard because these are forever chemicals. Getting the pollution out of the air, getting the PM 2.5 millimeter, air particulate matter in the air, is going to be really, really hard. Okay. There's a lot of stuff that is sort of like baked into the cake now all over the world in terms of obesogens, things that are driving adiposity. But sugar, we could fix. That one we could fix. And that's what's going on for about 75% of the population. So for me, that's where you start. And I've also shown with other studies that if you don't stop the sugar, nothing else will fix it. Nothing else will matter. It's the red line. You have to do that first before anything else will work. So we need to apply that first. And because 75% of people have this as the problem, this needs to be across the board. And that's why it's a public health issue, not a personal issue. That's why governments have to get involved. That's why doctors have to understand. But of course they don't.
Right, right. And some are waking up. And I think that as a patient, the number of times I've worked with people, or even in my own family and circles, have said, well, my doctor said, there's still so much trust in doctors. And if doctors were trained to say, you need to just eat whole foods, let the sugar and the processed foods go. We're trying to heal your metabolism. 0 is better than none, but do your best. And, that in and of itself could have a massive impact.
Yeah, absolutely. If it actually happened. Now, part of the problem also, Florence, is that people say, well, I don't eat sugar because I don't buy candy bars or cakes or ice cream. Well, that's good. That's 16% of your dose. Okay. I don't drink soft drinks. Okay. That's 37% of your dose. So 37 and 16, that's 53%. That means that 47% of your sugar consumption is in foods you didn't even know. The breakfast cereal, the yogurt, the processed meats, the even the vegetables, the barbecue potato chips. I mean, just going down the list. Okay. But it's all in ultra processed foods. That's where it is. That's the marker. That's the hallmark of sugar. That's where it lives. So, that's where we have to fix the problem. So there are people who say, oh, I don't eat sugar. Oh, yes, they do.
Right, right. And they often don't even think of bread as sugar.
Right.
There's other refined carbohydrates that act similar to white.
So other refined carbohydrates have glucose. And glucose stimulates insulin, and insulin stimulates weight gain. So that's important. But fructose, the sweet molecule in sugar, that's the one that causes the fatty liver, and that's the one that causes the chronic metabolic disease. So that's why some people are obese without being metabolically ill, and that's why some people are metabolically ill without being obese. The ones that are obese without being metabolically ill, the glucose drove the insulin, drove the adiposity. The ones that are metabolically ill without being obese, they've got fatty liver. And that was specifically from the fructose in the sugar.
Right. And Dr. Richard Johnson's work is showing us that if we have enough glucose coming in, not even fructose or fructose, we're not even eating that. If just enough glucose comes in, the body can convert it to
Absolutely.
fructose.
Totally. There's an enzyme called the polyol pathway. It's called aldose reductase, which can basically take glucose and turn it into fructose. Mm-hmm. And when that happens most?
When?
Pregnancy.
Really?
Really. So it's an even bigger consideration there. And it may be one of the reasons for gestational diabetes.
Wow.
So
wow.
Rick and I are good friends, and we actually have published a correspondence to Lancet that we're waiting on for over 2 months now. That it's sitting with the editor. But we did a podcast on sugar and Alzheimer's disease, that on the Levels channel called A Whole New Level. And so, Rick's totally on board, and I'm a big fan of Rick's, and he's got it right.
Yep. Yeah. And it's, wow, just when you think, well, I'm only eating potato chips, it's just like, it's healthy bread, right? If you eat enough of it, you're literally going to wind up with the same problem as someone who's binge eating ice cream.
Indeed.
bring us back to the topic of obesity. You said that I never want to hear anybody talk about the obesity epidemic again, because it's the food industry's mantra. That is what they use to obfuscate the truth. And you play right into it when you talk about it. Say more about that.
Right. Well, it's very simple. Obesity is about energy balance. Energy balance. Energy, in, energy out. Energy balance. Right? So the standard mantra is, if you eat it, you better burn it, or you're going to store it. Now, if that's true, then the adiposity, the energy, the store it part, is secondary to two primary behaviors: gluttony, if you're going to eat it, and sloth. You better burn it. So gluttony and sloth. So the adiposity is a manifestation of two behaviors. And therefore, if you are fat, number one, it is your fault. Number two, if you are fat, you have no willpower. Number three, if you are fat, you are a glutton and a sloth. And if you are fat, number four, you don't deserve to live.
Oof.
That comes from this notion of energy balance. But energy balance is hinged on a concept. The concept is called the calorie, because that's the only way to measure energy balance, is calories in, calories out. Now, the question is, does the calorie work? Is the calorie a useful measure? And the answer is not even remotely. Okay, it was a mistake from the beginning, and the more research we've done, the more bigger the mistake is. But the food industry doesn't want to give it up, because it's its gravy train, because it's the thing that assuages its culpability and puts the onus on the consumer. So they're still spouting and spewing calories about everything, because this is what they hide behind. So we have boatloads of data to show that the energy balance model really does not work. Now, there is a second way to interpret the first law of thermodynamics, and that is, instead of starting with the primary behaviors, let's start with the biochemical process. If you're going to store it, that is an obligate weight gain set up by high insulin levels out of your control, and you expect to burn it, that is normal energy expenditure for normal quality of life. Because energy expenditure and quality of life are the same thing. They're synonymous. Things that make your energy expenditure go up make you feel good, like exercise. Things that make your energy expenditure go down make you feel lousy, like hypothyroidism, starvation. So if you expect to burn it, if you're going to store it and you expect to burn it, then you're going to have to eat it. Okay, and so now the primary phenomenon is the weight gain, the adiposity, and the two behaviors of gluttony and sloth, they're subservient to that primary phenomenon of high insulin driving weight gain. In which case, the behaviors are not your fault. The behaviors are not something you had control over. In fact, you didn't have control over any of it, because you didn't have any control of how high your insulin went. So that's called the energy storage theory, or the carbohydrate insulin model. So we have the energy balance model, we have the carbohydrate insulin model. Now, actually, we have two more theories. One is called the redox model. It has to do with changes in reactive oxygen species generation within the cells, because these are signaling molecules by themselves, right inside cells, and they can alter how your cell processes energy on the fly, right in the cell. And the third one is the obesogen theory, that there are all of these compounds in our environment, which we mentioned before, that are actually driving adiposity and metabolic dysfunction that have nothing to do with behavior. So the question is, can you fit all of these together, these four hypotheses? And the answer is yes, you can. And so my colleagues, Jerry Heindel, Barbara Corky, and I have written a manuscript, and it is going to be submitted shortly.
Wow. And integrating all of them
into one model, one unified model. That actually makes sense. And when you understand that model, then you realize that the focus has to be on prevention.
Got it. Right. And that really there's a theme of pollution, that sugar is a form of pollution to the body, that obesogens are forms of pollution in water, air, right? That the detoxification, that to reverse obesity, we're really talking about a detoxification process. Get off
the environment.
Fix
the environment. We have totally, completely effed our environment.
Right.
And
people are wandering around.
Now we're seeing the consequences.
Right. People are wandering around blaming themselves, but it makes no more sense to blame yourself for having a peanut allergy than to have obesity.
That's right.
Yeah, not your fault.
Not your fault.
And if you keep looking to the medical system for medications to, I know they're doing their best. I believe that their intentions are good. They're trying to help, but they're just not getting to the root cause of it. And that if you just have the right information and the right support, you might actually be able to not only prevent, but truly reverse some of the impacts of metabolic dysfunction and truly, find this happiness that Dr. Lustig's talking about.
Well, I've been bringing this up the entire conversation, but look, I'm not against GLP-1 analogs. It's not that I'm against them.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I ran the obesity program at UCSF for children for 17 years. All right. And I had a lot of kids on medicine. Okay. 1/4 of the kids in my clinic were on metformin because that was targeting the actual pathology. These kids had hepatic insulin resistance, and that's where metformin works. It works on the liver to improve insulin sensitivity. And so for the right patient, the metformin actually was very valuable and worked well. Okay. So I'm not against medicine, and I'm not even against GLP-1 analogs. Mm-hmm. I'm against the idea that we're going to be able to find one medicine that's going to solve this problem. That's not true. So I think that GLP-1 analogs will be an adjunct to environmental change. But I do not think it will end up being a primary therapy.
Right, because it runs the risk of side effects that might require additional medications, and it never gets to the root cause. It doesn't turn it around at the metabolic level.
Exactly. It doesn't fix the mitochondria.
Right. And just knowing that, right, that's information that's not out there. I have one of my co-hosts for the summit this year. Her name is Shun, and she's a nurse, and she works in a medical clinic, and half of her staff is on a GLP-1, and they're so excited about it, and they're pushing it everywhere, and they're prescribing it left, right, and center, and they're genuinely feeling joy at prescribing it because they think this is going to be so helpful. But if they had access to this information, could they feel as joyful? Could they feel as excited about what's possible?
Well, I'm going to tell you, that's a little hard because fixing the environment is not something that individuals can do alone.
Right.
This has to be at a societal level. This has to be at a national level. This has to be at a governmental level. This has to be at a global level.
Yeah.
This is not a quick slam dunk. All right. It is going to be much harder, but it's going to have much more far-reaching, long-lasting effects that will ultimately be cheaper. And that's what governments have to understand. Problem is, number one, the patients think there's a magic bullet, so they don't want to fix their environment. Number two, the food industry is making money hand over fist, so they don't want to fix the environment. And the politicians are not going to want to be voted out because they took this as a stance when their patient, when the patients didn't quite understand what it was about. So they're not going to really want to fix the environment. Until we get everybody to the table and make sure that everybody understands what the real problem is, this will continue to plague us.
Yes, cause unbelievable suffering, especially in children that are the ultimate of innocence. what drives me crazy is every year I invite the World Health Organization to come and speak to the summit.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Right? I've sent emails, I've sent phone calls. I said, I'll fly to Geneva. Like, you guys started this internationally, bringing health ministers and prime ministers together. They signed the Rome Declaration in 2014, I think, or 2014, saying that they agreed to go back to their countries and to try and get the sugar consumption in their countries below 9 teaspoons for men and below 6 added teaspoons for women. And there's no follow through. I don't know.
Right. There's no enforcement on.
Right.
I know. I'm very aware. No, look, I know people who work for WHO, and they individually are very, very nice and very good and very worthwhile. I work with Michael Roberts, who is the head of the UCLA Resnick Center for Food Policy and Obesity, and he has a project with the FAO in Rome, and sugar is part of that. So I know that that is actually being looked at a WHO level, but, actually, researching it and doing something about it, of course, are two different things.
Right. We know what happened when people tried to ban alcohol. What was it called?
Prohibition.
I'm sorry, what was it?
Prohibition.
Thank you. That's exactly the word I'm looking for. All hell broke loose, right? Like, you just don't take away people's drugs of choice. Don't take away
if you're gonna take away people's addictions, you got to substitute another one. And that's the problem with addiction transfer. So if you take away people's sugar, what are you going to put in its place? So how many stories have you heard of people who had bariatric surgery for their obesity and then became chronic alcoholics? Carney Wilson.
Yeah.
Brian Wilson's daughter, from the Beach Boys, singer herself. She had that. Hear about it all the time. My favorite newspaper article in the history of all of my reading of newspapers, which is a lot, was published on August 15th, 2014 in Newsday, which is a newspaper out of Long Island, New York. Okay. And the title of the article is "Off Sugar and Ready to Tear My Eyes Out."
Oh my God, what a compelling title.
And it is written by a Republican operative. His name is William F.B. O'Reilly. Not Bill O'Reilly, from Fox News. No, different guy. Okay. But also a Republican operative. And this guy, he was a smoker. And then he realized he needed to stop. And so he started drinking. And then, of course, the drinking got in his way and started putting on extra pounds. And so he stopped drinking. So he switched to sugar. And now his blood pressure's up and his arteries are starting to clog. And he's, actually more overweight than he even was before. And then he learns about me. And he watches that famous YouTube video, Sugar, the Bitter Truth, from 2009. And he writes this article, this op-ed piece, and everyone can find it. Just do Newsday, William F.B. O'Reilly, sugar. It'll come up. And and he curses me out. He never met me before, but he curses me out because he knows I'm right. He says the last line of the article is, "And I hate Dr. Lustig."
I hate that guy. Right. Right. And yet at the same time, it's heartbreaking to think that you can choose to take or leave this information, but it's we're doing our darndest to get it out. You can decide, you have the adult right to choose what, chemicals you want, drugs, alcohol, vaping, whatever. But we protect children under the age of 18 from addictive substances. Sugar is a known toxin, known addictive substance, and we're doing nothing to protect children. So if you can't save yourself, can we at least come together to protect them?
Look, the bottom line is everyone has their addiction. It's what gets you up in the morning.
Yeah.
And if it's not a substance, then it's a behavior. It might be work. It might be caffeine. It might be something that is a productive addiction as opposed to a non-productive addiction. Might be exercise.
Yeah,
Okay. Everybody's got their one. And because that's what gets you up. So I don't want to basically, like tell people they can't be addicted. Okay. When you block the reward system, and there are two medicines now, by the way, that block the reward system. The first one in 2006 was a endocannabinoid antagonist called rimonabant. Well, the trade name was Acomplia. It never made it to approval in the U.S. The FDA never approved it. It was approved in Europe, but it was never approved in the U.S. And the reason it never got approved in the U.S. was because in Europe they started, post-marketing surveillance after approval, and they found that a whole lot of people were getting severely depressed, and there were 21 suicides.
Oh gosh.
And the reason is because when you block the reward system, there's no reason to live.
Mm-hmm.
Well, guess what? GLP-1 analogs have induced severe depression and suicidal ideation.
Is a rare one off, or is kind of common?
Well, common enough that it's, it made it all the way up to the FDA.
Really? I didn't know
So,
that.
is that such a good idea? I don't think so.
I love another quote you've got on your website. Every substance and behavior that drives up your reward triggers will just as quickly drive down your reward receptors.
Yep.
Speak more about that.
Called tolerance. I mean, so, dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Dopamine is reward. Okay. It is learning. It is positive reinforcement. It is reward. It is all three rolled up into one. Okay. So you need dopamine. I'm not saying you don't. Dopamine is essential for learning. All right. So the ventral tegmental area is where the dopamine neurons are. The nucleus accumbens is where the dopamine receptors are. And information goes from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens, binds to a receptor, dopamine binds to the receptor, and then you get a signal transduction, and that is the feeling of reward. Now, what does reward feel like? Well, there are a lot of rewards. You can pick your reward. It depends on who you are. It can be in the food category. It can be in the, in the work category. It can be in the, sex category. It can be, all over the place. There's a lot of rewards. Okay. But that feeling of, wow, I got this and I want more. This feels good. I want more. That's reward. Here's the problem. Dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Now, neurons like to be excited. That's why they have receptors. But neurons like to be tickled, not bludgeoned. Chronic overstimulation of any neuron, and it doesn't have to be with dopamine, it can be with any excitatory neurotransmitter, glutamate, for example. Chronic overstimulation will cause neuronal cell death because neurons can't fire fast enough. When you cause them to fire too fast, they burn out. You burn out the machinery that allows those neurons to maintain themselves and to rest and, get ready for the next stimulus. And the reason we know this is because of kids with chronic seizure disorders. So when a 2-year-old or 3-year-old has status epilepticus and they go into nonstop seizure, we have to break that seizure. The longer that seizure goes, the more brain tissue is going to be lost. It's going to infarct. It's going to basically die. All right. So it behooves us as pediatricians in emergency rooms to stop that seizure as fast as possible. Okay, because you're trying to preserve that kid's brain. All right. So chronic overstimulation of any neuron leads to neuronal cell death. Glutamate, chronic glutamate. That's why they always, made, big deal about MSG.
Mm-hmm.
Well, dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Now, neurons don't want to die. So they have a survival mechanism. They have a plan B. They have an alternative. They downregulate the number of receptors. So there's less chance that any ligand, any hormone or neurotransmitter will find a receptor. There are fewer of them. Okay. And if there are fewer of them, then there's less chance that the cell will fire. So what you end up with is more and more for less and less. And that's the law of diminishing returns. That's called tolerance. Okay. That's one reason why addicts will shoot up even more and more than what they did before and won't even be able to feel it. They use more and more to get less and less because there are fewer receptors to be able to be able to see the dopamine. Okay. And when those neurons actually do start to die, that's addiction. And those neurons don't come back.
They do not come back.
They do not come back. They do not regrow.
You cannot regrow dopamine cells that you've burnt out?
Correct.
Or neuroreceptors?
Correct.
No way.
And that's why when you take a hardcore addict who's had their neurons lost and you get them into rehab,
they're miserable.
and they go clean, they are miserable.
Yeah.
And the reason is because they have less dopamine now to start with, because they've lost those neurons. They're dead. So they can only get this much of a response, whereas they used to be able to go all the way up. And now they only get like half a response or a quarter of a response. And it doesn't feel good, which of course is why so many of them will then say, oh man, I feel like shit. I need to go back and use more. And now they're recidivists. That's why there's so much relapse. And it's also they use the dose that they used to start with, that they were on, before they quit. Okay. And that's why so many of them end up, succumbing, and how many die, like John Belushi and
overdose
and Philip Seymour Hoffman and Amy Winehouse, etc. Okay. So it all makes sense when you understand how the dopamine system works. Point is, when you're addicted to one thing, your dopamine receptors are downregulated. Well, that dopamine system is the same dopamine system no matter what your drug of choice. Whether it's cocaine, whether it's heroin, whether it's nicotine, whether it's alcohol, whether it's sugar. Point is, you are addicted to all of them. You're addicted to one, you're addicted to all. And so all you end up doing is playing this little hopscotch game of addiction transfer. So you end up switching from smoking to drinking, drinking to eating, just like this William F.B. O'Reilly did. Okay, addiction transfer. You know who the world's expert on addiction transfer is?
Mm-hmm.
Oprah.
Oprah, really?
Oprah. Yeah, this is what she did, her entire life.
Oh, you mean living out? I see. Yeah, interesting.
Okay. So we need to understand that addiction, that dopamine is the wrong goal. Yes, you need dopamine to get out of bed in the morning, but dopamine is not what you should be basing your life's work on.
So the chase for dopamine is not what we should be chasing. What should we be chasing?
Serotonin.
Oxytocin.
A different neurotransmitter.
Mm-hmm.
The contentment neurotransmitter.
Mm-hmm.
The neurotransmitter that lets you sit like a frog.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The neurotransmitter that says, this feels good. I don't want or need anymore. The neurotransmitter that it's the difference between loneliness and solitude is serotonin. Okay. Loneliness and solitude from the outside look exactly the same. Right? But on the inside, they're very different.
Yes.
Why are they different? Serotonin.
Low versus adequate serotonin versus low serotonin.
Correct.
And here's where the plot thickens, doesn't it, Dr. Lustig? Because I know for a fact, from the work of Dr. Kathleen Desmaisons, that sugar also spikes serotonin, which means that there's downregulation of serotonin receptor sites. Do those ones come back?
No. Well, so yes. So serotonin is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So only excitatory neurotransmitters downregulate their own receptor.
Oh.
Inhibitory neurotransmitters don't.
They
because
don't
they
burn
don't
out
need
the
to.
same
They
way.
don't need to because the neurons don't burn out because they're inhibitory.
Ah,
So they're not over exciting the next neuron.
oh, so that's hopeful. So even though we think we've pooched our brains with our addiction, we haven't, because the real neurotransmitters, the inhibitory ones, are still capable of being restored and repaired.
This is why yoga and mindfulness and
Walks in nature,
walks in nature and music and
hugs.
psychedelics, okay, are a thing. You know, they're all trying to boost serotonin.
Mhm. Psychedelics are different than, it's not acting on the dopamine receptor.
No, it's acting on the serotonin receptor.
Give me an example of a
All,
psychedelic.
all psychedelics are serotoninergic.
Really? Is that like magic mushrooms and
Yeah, magic mushroom, psilocybin, peyote, mescaline, DMT, MDMA. Well, MDMA is different because MDMA is a dopamine and serotonin reuptake inhibitor, so it does a little of both. But yeah,
interesting. I
because
didn't,
in
I
chapter
just
8 of my
assumed.
book, Hacking the American Mind.
Okay, okay. I have not read that book, obviously.
Well, that's the book you should read in Florence for sure.
Clearly, I'm really interested in this. Okay, I feel like I've missed out. Um, right, fascinating. I didn't know that. I just assumed all drugs of use and abuse are somehow working on the dopamine receptor sites.
No, they're not.
And yet, when you come
By,
off
by,
those
the way, by
drugs,
the way, you actually, what you said is actually true. All drugs of abuse. The question is, are psychedelics drugs of abuse? No.
is pot a drug of abuse? Like a drug of abuse?
Yes, pot's a drug of abuse.
It acts on dopamine.
It acts on dopamine, also acts on endocannabinoids,
Mm.
but it does not act on serotonin.
What about alcohol?
Alcohol acts on dopamine.
It does, yeah. Fascinating.
Alcohol actually lowers serotonin.
And it lowers
The
serotonin.
stress lowers serotonin big time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the good news is that that part of the brain can be repaired. That's the most hopeful thing. Because it's a little depressing to think we've burnt out all of our dopamine receptor sites. So maybe we live a little more low-key life if we've, done a lot of drugs and burned out those dopamine receptor sites.
Well, one way to help that is to cut the sugar.
Totally. Because we're literally burning out our dopamine, our feel-good, drive, excitement, adventure, bliss neuroreceptors are literally being burnt out by the consumption of sugar.
That's right.
So, wow, if you want to keep your dopamine receptor sites and have that a feeling of being alive, like all the good that dopamine has to offer us, yeah, there's your reason to break up with sugar. Dr. Lustig, is there anything more you'd like to say today? I think that's a hell of a good place to end.
Didn't we do enough damage?
Didn't we scare people enough?
Yeah. I don't know what to tell you. Look, I have one thing to say. Okay. You can't solve a problem if you don't know what the problem is. And for the last 50 years, we've been solving the wrong problem. And we now have the data to show what the actual problem is. So it's time to solve the real problem. But unfortunately, people are too addicted.
Right.
And so, how do you fix a belief system? It's hard. It's hard to fix a belief system. But that's what we have to do. We got all these MAGAs voting for Trump. How do you fix their belief system? These are hard questions. Can it be done? The answer is yes, and I can prove it. Do people change religions? When I was a kid, only 2% of people changed religions, and usually because of intermarriage. Today, 25% of people change religions.
Wow.
And it has nothing to do with intermarriage. So people can change belief systems, but it's hard.
And
You
if we
have
can't,
you have to have good reason to do so.
right.
And it can't just be reason that you understand here. It has to be reason you understand right here.
You feel it in your body.
You have to feel it in your body. That's a tough one.
Yeah. And I will just add that even though we talked about this is a food culture malfunction that has deeply impacted our metabolic health, that has led to a whole ocean of chronic disease, and that the root is, food and pollution in the environment. And I get it. And at the same time, there's an inner ecosystem, and you can be in charge of that. What goes into your internal environment? So just take this information, let it fire you up, and have the courage to be, if you're the only person in your family, your community, at work that eats whole foods, that's okay. The rest of the world will catch up, or unfortunately, they will suffer and they will die prematurely, likely.
We try to save everybody we can, but you can only save people who want to be saved.
Right. May that be you. Thanks for your time today, Dr. Lustig. I'm so sorry. I think I cut you off there.
I just said I'm doing my best.
Me too. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed this interview. And before you go, do one more thing. Stop, think back on the interview while it's fresh in your mind, and write down your favorite takeaway in a special dedicated journal. If you do this, at the end of the summit, you'll have a page or two of nuggets of wisdom to guide you forward. And remember, this is just the beginning. At the end of the summit, you'll be invited to attend a free webinar where I will personally summarize the key insights of our speakers and pull it all together into a practical plan of action. You can also check out our Facebook page where you can connect with others and ask questions, and our Kick Sugar Coach podcast and YouTube channel for additional inspiration. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in the next interview.